Hello and welcome to my channel, In Search of Wonder. My name is Anne and today I'm going to talk about my favorite author ever. Of course, I'm talking about who else? Jane Austen. Now, many people have already spoken at length and made fantastic videos about how to read Jane Austen if you've never read her before, but I just thought I would add my voice to the mix. I'm not an expert by any means. I have not studied literature for a degree or anything like that. I am just a lifelong huge fan of Jane Austen. I have read all of her novels more than once, some of them multiple times, and I have read a lot of analysis of Jane Austen and about her herself. I'm just a really big fan. So I thought that I would share some things that I have learned along the way in my journey with Jane Austen as far as what I love about her books. And if you have not read Jane Austen, or if you have struggled to enjoy Jane Austen and her writing, maybe some of the things that I share today might give you some insight or perspective on her books or on her writing, etc. Or maybe nothing here is helpful at all. That's fine too. Let's get on. I have basically 5 suggestions, starting with the most basic and moving on to more of an advanced appreciation for Austen. Step 1, or my first bit of advice, not really step 1 per se, but the most basic level of Austen enjoyment is watch adaptations. And many of you suggested this when I asked for your tips on how to read Austen. And many of you said that your first encounter with Jane Austen was a movie adaptation or a TV adaptation, and that really helped you to understand what the story was about before you delved into the actual book. So, and I think that is fantastic. I was trying to remember which came first, the chicken or the egg, for myself personally, but it's been so long. I was a teenager. I was a young teenager when I first read Jane Austen. And I want to say, by the time I saw the 1995 BBC Pride and Prejudice and the 1995 Sense and Sensibility with Emma Thompson, I was already a big Austen fan and had already read at least several of her books by that point. But watching those movies only deepened my appreciation for Austen. And so I have a few suggestions of what are by many people considered to be the best adaptations. You will find disagreement for sure. People will argue about this vehemently, but there is more or less consensus on these adaptations. First of all, the 1995 BBC Pride and Prejudice, which I mentioned, is the best in terms of sticking to the book and really telling Austen's story. And there's a lot of dialogue that is lifted straight from the book. The scenes are mostly from the book. They add some things, particularly from Darcy's perspective. In my opinion, it doesn't detract from what Austen was doing or the story Austen was writing. I think it only enhances it. So it doesn't bother me. It does bother some people. Some people prefer I think it's the 1980 one, but I personally think the 1995 one is the best and is thoroughly enjoyable. Then the 1995 Sense and Sensibility with Emma Thompson, the movie version, is fantastic. I loved it. I've always loved that movie. I mean, it's been a long time since I've seen it, but so I may change my mind, but I really love that one. And I think that they did an excellent job of being faithful to Austen's story while condensing it into a movie format and dramatizing it a little bit, to be sure. Although there's plenty of drama in that story. There's also the 2008 Sense and Sensibility BBC version, which is a mini series. So it's more of a time investment. In my opinion, they ripped off of the 1995 movie quite a bit. Last year, I watched the 2008 BBC version after I read the book, and I noticed that there were some things in the 2008 version, like just small things, nothing big, that were not in the book, but were in the 1995 movie. So I really feel like they were ripping off of that some. But it's very good. And then we have for Emma, the 1996 Gwyneth Paltrow Emma is actually really well done. Again, for a movie, it's great because they have to condense that story into a shorter format and make it dramatic enough for a 2.5-hour movie or whatever. Personally, I feel like they did a great job. And then we have the 2009 Emma BBC, which is my favorite mini-series version of it. the acting is great. Like the casting was perfect in that one. And the dynamics, the chemistry between Emma and Mr. Knightley are just perfection. I really enjoy that one. Then for Persuasion, the only one I've seen is the 1995 Persuasion, which is fine. I don't particularly love, a lot of people love the casting of Captain Wentworth. I don't know, I'm not fully on board with that, but it is faithful to the book and they do a good job for a movie version of that. I do want to see the 2007 Persuasion, which actually is going to be the one we're going to watch as part of our Jane Austen birthday celebration this year. For Mansfield Park, the only one I've seen is the 1983 miniseries, which was very well done in terms of sticking to Austen's story and telling the story that Austen was telling, but the videography is ancient and horrible, and the acting is a little iffy at times. I really want to see the late 90s version and compare. I've heard very mixed reviews of that one, but I'm curious to watch that one. And then for Northanger Abbey, there is an older miniseries, which I've not seen, and then there's the 2007 miniseries, which is miniseries, yeah, I don't think it's a movie, which I've seen a couple of times and really enjoy. I mean, it's very faithful to the story. Well done. I also want to mention the 2016 movie Love and Friendship. Incredibly well done. I don't know why they called it Love and Friendship because it's actually the story of Lady Susan. And I have not watched it since reading Lady Susan, so I can't tell you how faithful it is to the book. I haven't compared them back to back, but what I remember of the movie, when I read the book, I felt like it was pretty faithful in at least capturing the essence of the story that Austen was telling. So anyway, I feel like that was a really well done adaptation, and I personally recommend it. So if you are new to classics in general, if you don't read a lot of classics, I definitely 100% recommend starting with the adaptations. But if you are already accustomed to reading classics, then you can just jump into the books and just enjoy them for what they are. But my next suggestion is to manage your expectations a little bit, because people who love Jane Austen really, really love Jane Austen. Am I right? Poster child here. So many people absolutely love Jane Austen. So if you have not yet been initiated into Jane Austen fandom, you may get a certain expectation that the books are going to be amazing, they're going to sweep you off your feet, and you're going to love them. But they may not be what you're used to reading that sweeps you off your feet, that excites you, that interests you, that you really love. So I do think it's helpful to manage your expectations and to know what you're going to expect. And the first thing I want to say is that Jane Austen is subtle, and her stories are subtle. There is a surface story, and you can just sit and you can read and enjoy the surface story, particularly if you are someone who loves more, I can't think of what the genre would be, but more character-driven books, slower paced books, books that are more of everyday situations, everyday life kind of books. If you like those, you probably will naturally gravitate toward Austen. But if you are more of an adventure story reader or fantasy or suspense or thriller, that kind of thing, there is none of that in Austen. And it is not fast-paced. There is not a big complicated plot that drives the story. It's very character driven. I mean, there's a plot and the plot is important, but it's very character driven. So keep that in mind. That's what you should expect in an Austen novel, not an exciting, fast-paced, plot-driven story. So Austen is very subtle. Virginia Woolf is famous for her admiration of Austen, and she has written about Austen, critiquing Austen's literary style, and she had this to say. First of all, she said, "Of all great writers, she is the most difficult to catch in the act of greatness." Because sometimes at a first cursory read of an Austen book, you might be wondering, why do people love this? I don't get it. Woolf also said, "Jane Austen is thus a mistress of much deeper emotion than appears upon the surface. She stimulates us to supply what is not there. What she offers is apparently a trifle, yet is composed of something that expands in the reader's mind and endows with the most enduring form of life scenes which are outwardly trivial. Always, the stress is laid upon character. The turns and twists of the dialogue keep us on the tenterhooks of suspense. Our attention is half upon the present moment, half upon the future. Here, indeed, in this unfinished and in the main inferior story, are all the elements of Jane Austen's greatness. And I feel like Virginia Woolf explains it better than I could. She's absolutely right. The greatness, the amazingness of her craft and her ability is not on the surface. It's underneath the surface of her writing and of the story that she's telling. Another expectation you may need to manage going into an Austen novel is the romantic aspect of her stories. There is a misconception, I think, on a lot of people because Jane fans will often talk about who their favorite hero is and, which couple is the best couple, Lizzie and Darcy, or Emma and Mr. Knightley, Anne and Captain Wentworth. And the truth is that each of Austen's heroines do end up with a love match, and they do end up marrying the hero of the story. However, the hero of the story isn't really that much of a hero usually because in most of the books, we get very little on-page time with them. Austen does not spend a great deal of time with the heroes of the story, with the male main characters. She touches on them a little bit. I think in Emma, we get a couple of scenes that are told from Mr. Knightley's perspective, but that's a little bit unusual. Actually, it's very unusual in Austen's novels. She doesn't really get into her male main characters' heads at all. We don't see a great deal from their perspective. And we also don't get to spend a lot of time with them. In Pride and Prejudice, Darcy and Lizzie do actually have quite a few scenes together. And in Emma and Mr. Knightley, because they live not far from each other and because they've been lifelong friends, there are a lot of scenes with them together. But most of our heroines don't get to spend a great deal of time with the male main character of this story, to the extent that I would say they're not even the male main character. They just end up being the love match for the heroine of the story. The story is really about the girl at the center of the story, or in the case of Sense and Sensibility, two girls, Eleanor and Marianne. And they learn a lot through their experiences with their love lives and that sort of thing, but it's about them. It's not about their romance. And even when Austen brings the couples together at the end of the book and ties everything up with a bow, there's not a great deal of romantic scenes happening. There's not a great deal that is said that is romantic. She certainly doesn't talk about kisses or anything like that. She may mention an embrace. She may mention them spending time together. I know in Mansfield Park, she mentions briefly that Edmund Bertram and Fanny Price, sat on a garden bench and talked at length, but she doesn't tell us what they talked about. She doesn't tell us the course of the conversation. Even the conversation between Lizzie and Darcy at the end of Pride and Prejudice, she does write out some of their dialogue, and Mr. Darcy does say some fairly romantic things to Lizzie, but she also just mentions things that they talked about. She doesn't tell you the actual conversation. It's just a passing mention. Oh, they discussed this. And she doesn't dig into that conversation. So there's not a great deal that happens in Austen's books that is romantic. So they're not the romance novel like you would be used to, which is ironic, I think, because I feel like Jane Austen was the forerunner in some ways of the modern romance novel, but romance was secondary to the rest of what she was telling in the story that she was telling about her books. Her focus is definitely on the female main character of the story and what she learns and how she grows. So the next thing, the next suggestion, I guess, that I would make for enjoying Jane Austen is read it to enjoy. Like, just read it for fun. The first time you go to read Austen, just read it to enjoy the story, armed with the knowledge of what you will expect to find in the story and what you will not find. Just sit back and enjoy it, because Jane Austen is as funny as all get out. Now remember, subtle. she's subtle. We don't have slapstick humor all over the place here. Sometimes you may not even realize she's being funny because it's hidden beneath a layer of irony, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But she's definitely very funny. There are moments, in particular, I remember Pride and Prejudice, like laugh out loud moments, things that she says in the narrative and the things that Lizzie says in particular are very amusing. And then also in Northanger Abbey, there are some hilarious things that Austen says. So just enjoy the wit and the humor in the stories. And also enjoy how she is playing with the characters in the story. Not playing with the characters, but describing the characters, helping us get to know these people she created, these children of hers. They were very real to her, and she spent her whole adult life, honestly, crafting these wonderful characters, and they come to life in the pages. So just enjoy getting to know them. It's like the best way for an introvert to meet new people, okay? Just enter the pages of the book and you will meet some amazing people that you will recognize aspects of their character because they're so lifelike. They will seem like real people that you have actually met before, but without all of the pain and angst and the social anxiety of actually having to meet them in person. They're in the pages of the book. Just enjoy her characters and enjoy her wit and just enjoy the story and the ride along the story. But if you're ready for more, if you come to Austen having been armed already with a history of reading a lot of classics and you're already very familiar with how to read a classic and reading literature, and or if you've already read Austen once or twice but you want to try again and see what there is to enjoy in Austen, what there is to love about Austen, then I have some suggestions for reading for more enrichment, getting more out of Austen's books than you might get on a cursory read just for enjoyment. First of all, Jane Austen was one of the first to use what's called free indirect discourse and or omniscient narrative. So her narrator in the story is third person, but is in the heads of the characters, particularly our main female character. And our narrator knows what the character is thinking and feeling and will say that, but will not say Jane thought or Lizzie thought. She will just put it in the narration what they are thinking. She will do that also with what they are saying sometimes. So the dialogue is not always spelled out. It's not always separated by quotation marks with she said. It's just mentioned what the conversation was about. So keep that in mind as you are reading, and read a little bit more carefully so that you can understand when she is talking about what the character is thinking about and when she's actually just describing the scene and the setting and everything. Also, be aware of irony. This is where the subtlety comes into play. What Austen says is not always what Austen means. And you'll get a feel for it as you're reading, and you'll be able to recognize when she's being ironic. To start with, Pride and Prejudice, the famous opening line. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a fortune must be in want of a wife. That's her famous opening statement in Pride and Prejudice. Do not take that literally. She is not being literal. She doesn't mean that. She is poking fun. She is poking fun at Mrs. Bennet. And who opens up the first chapter of Pride and Prejudice? A dialogue between Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Bennet. There are many such, Austen utilizes this irony throughout her novels, and that's what makes them so funny, but that's also what adds to the subtlety of her storytelling. It's not always obvious on a first read or at the surface that she's being ironic. So keep an eye out for that when you are reading her stories. It's also important to remember, of course, that language has changed somewhat. So first of all, Jane Austen is using pretty complex sentence structures in her books a lot. Not always. Like, I actually feel like they're pretty readable, but she does have some complex sentence structures, and she's using maybe some more complex vocabulary. Also, she is definitely using some words that we may be familiar with, but she's using them differently than we would use today. And one example that comes to mind immediately is the word nice. It had a very different meaning back in the early 1800s, late 1700s than it does today. Today, it's kind of a vague word meaning good or fine, nice, kind. That's nice. You know, we say that it's just kind of a vague filler word. But back then, it had a very different meaning. It was a lot more specific. I think I would equate it more to fastidious. Like, I think back then, nice had more of that connotation of being fastidious, of being like particular maybe about something, or very careful about something. So it didn't mean the same thing. So you have to be aware there are some language differences in Austen's writing. And of course, cultural differences. I mean, that's obvious by some aspects of the plot. We don't live in that sort of culture anymore. And that's just kind of like the background of Austen's story. We just clearly, in many ways, don't live like that anymore. So just be aware there are some cultural differences that may not make sense to us as 21st century people, but it was perfectly normal. I mean, it was the culture at the time that Austen was writing in. Also, I think it helps to understand the influences that affected Austen's writing, which is one reason why Charlene and I are reading some other books that Austen read and loved and inspired her writing. In particular, we just read Pamela for the month of January. We are slated to read Lover's Vows, which is a play that is featured heavily in Mansfield Park and becomes an important part of this story. And we also will be reading an Anne Radcliffe novel later this year because she also heavily influenced Austen's writing, and also Fanny Burney was another one. So reading those authors and understanding the authors and the influences of Austen will help you to enjoy her books more as well. But that's definitely like next level. That's if you've read all of Austen's novels and you're hungry for more and you want to learn more, that would bring you to the next level of enjoyment, of really appreciating and analyzing what Austen was doing and some of the reasons behind or the history behind her approach to a story. Another thing, and again, this might be a more next level sort of thing if you're ready to go deeper with Austen, I would say it's very important in Austen to look at the contrasts. That's probably something that a literature teacher might say about any classic novel. But in Austen, she is very often comparing and contrasting either concepts or characters in the story. And it's sometimes in the titles, it's obvious. Pride and Prejudice, also Sense and Sensibility in particular, that's a really big one. Sense and Sensibility, she's definitely comparing and contrasting those two approaches to life and the need for a balance between the two, and characters who have one or the other or both, whatever. So she is definitely comparing and contrasting things in the story. Sometimes our main character is being contrasted with all of the people around her. In particular, Mansfield, actually, she does that a few times, I think, with Emma and with Persuasion and with Mansfield Park, Fanny Price. She is comparing, for example, in Mansfield Park, Fanny Price is representing virtue or goodness, and then all of the characters in the story around her are representing various vices like greed or gluttony or sloth, that kind of stuff. So she's comparing and contrasting those different types of characters in that story. I think it's also helpful to know what Austen is and is not writing about. Now, I've already touched on the fact that although there are love stories in her books, they're not really love stories per se. A lot of the experts will say that Jane Austen's novels are social commentary on her times. I personally don't see that. When I think of an author being like social commentary on their times, I think of Charles Dickens or George Eliot. Charles Dickens in particular is a very obvious example. You know, his books, he's very obvious about his commentary on society of his time and on social issues of his time. He's very clearly addressing them. I think Austen is only addressing them as a byproduct of the fact that she is writing about the society in which she lives. She has set her stories smack dab in the middle of the society that she was familiar with, and her stories are peopled with characters who came from her strata of society. Now, there are very different levels within that strata, but they're all more or less gentility of one level or another, and on different scales of wealth and position, etc. But they're all in that same general strata of nobility. She's not really concerning herself too much with lower class people. We do get Harriet, who ends up marrying a gentleman farmer, but really in most of the books, the characters who are poorer are members of the nobility or gentry who have fallen on hard times. So they've come down in the world. They're not necessarily lower class to start with. They may be poor at the moment, but they're not like from the lower class. You could make a case that, like, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, that Austen is speaking to against entails in the male line inheriting. You could make a case for that, but I think that she is just using that convention of her time to tell the story that she wants to tell. And in the case of Persuasion with Kellynch Hall, you know, you could make a case that she is speaking of against the way that the nobility spent recklessly and did not use their money or their funds wisely. But again, I think that she is just writing about people in her time and their foibles and their flaws. And I think that we could look around us and see the same kind of people today, regardless. So I think the social issues that she addresses in her book, I think is just a byproduct of the fact that that's the setting where her stories are. That's where it's taking place. That's what's happening. What Austen is really focusing on is the girl at the center of this story. She is telling us Lizzie's story. She is and also Jane's and Lydia's, but especially Lizzie. Lizzie is the main person that those two satellite around and affect Lizzie's story. And really their role is only in so much as how they affect Lizzie's story, right? And then in Sense and Sensibility, it's Eleanor and Marianne's story. In Mansfield Park, it's Fanny's story. In Northanger Abbey, it's Catherine's story. In Lady Susan, it's Lady Susan's story. And to a lesser extent, her daughter, but mostly it's Lady Susan's story. And then I'm missing one. Persuasion, it's Anne's story. She is focused on her main character, her female main character, and that is what the story is about. And she is focused on exploring character. And by that, I don't mean like a character in a story. I mean the character or the virtue of a person's being. She is exploring the things that affect a person's character and how a person's character affects the situation and the things around her, and how good character can be developed or made better by the choices one makes and by allowing those around you to shape you and your character. And she's exploring what is and is not good character in a variety of ways in a lot of her stories. So ultimately, I think they're not morality tales, because Jane Austen was the farthest thing from that. But in the end, she's really just exploring the strength of a person's good character and what it looks like and how it is developed throughout a story. And ultimately, honestly, that is what every good novel is really about. That's really the main idea. The best novels, that's what they are exploring. What good character looks like when it's placed in a variety of circumstances, and how character can grow and develop and change through the course of a person's life based on things that happen to them or trials that they have to go through, experiences that they have, or people that shape them, etc. Ultimately, that's at the heart of every good novel, and it's definitely at the heart of Austen's novels. Finally, if you want to really dig deep and read Austen with insight, I have some books in the description box that I read, and none of these are like really heavy, deep literary analysis type books, but they were very helpful for me in understanding the language that Austen was working with, like vocabulary, particularly from that era, and also customs of that time, and the setting and the cultural setting in which Austen was writing. And also they were helpful in understanding themes, etc. in Austen's books. This year, I'm interested to watch this video again at the end of this year and see if any of my thoughts have changed about Austen, because I am planning to read annotated versions of all of her novels, and I am assuming that from those annotations, I will get some more insight and information. By the way, I do think it's better to hold off on an annotated version until you already have read the books 1 or 2 times and have a solid feeling for what the story is and the character is. And then the annotations can add an extra layer of enjoyment, whereas if you read an annotated version, first of all, you may just get bogged down by the extra information and not be able to enjoy the story for what it is. So I'm hoping that I will gain more insight and more interest. Well, not more interest, I already am pretty interested, but I might gain more insight into what Austen was doing and writing in the time and the place and the setting. So that's another option, is to read an annotated version. Or of course you could read literary analysis online from, websites that like Lit Charts and what's the other one? Spark Notes, that give you understanding of the themes, etc. in the books. That's also helpful to read. And also, I will link a couple videos in the description box that I have found to be very helpful in understanding Austen and enjoying her more. One of them is not specifically related to Austen, but Tristan at Tristan the Classics. I really love his perspective on reading classics, and he made a fantastic video last year about approaching classics as a reader and the right way and the wrong way to go about it. And I think it was super helpful and super insightful. And I think that every reader who wants to read classics should watch his video, because it was really helpful. So I'm going to link to that also in the description box. And that will be a really helpful tool, I think, for any classic novel that you approach, but in particular, our favorite, Jane Austen. Finally, the only other thing I can say is read it again. Read the books again. When I first read through all of the Austen novels, I didn't love Mansfield Park. I thought it was boring, and I did not understand Northanger Abbey. I thought it was kind of lame. But both of those, on my second read through, Mansfield Park, I was blown away by Austen's craft. I think I was a more mature reader, and I understood it better. And also, I was just completely blown away by her amazing writing. And I really enjoyed the story. Northanger Abbey, in between the 2 times that I read it, I learned more about what it was and the context in which it was written, and that it was a satire of Gothic novels. And so that gave me a much deeper appreciation for it. And then I could see the humor in it, and I found that it was actually highly amusing. And Persuasion was another one that when I initially read it, I thought, oh, that was good. I liked it. I enjoyed it. But it didn't resonate with me at any level. But then when I read it 10 or 15 years later, it really resonated deeply with me, and I had a much better understanding of the story and what Austen was telling, and an appreciation for Anne Elliot as well. So that would be my only other suggestion, is to read it again and again. This year will be, I think, my 4th or 5th time reading Pride and Prejudice, and my 3rd time or fourth time reading Emma. The others I have read twice, so it will be my 3rd time reading all of the others. So I am looking forward to it, in particular Sense and Sensibility, which by the time this video goes live, we will have already started. So if this video was helpful, please let me know. And if you have any arguments with me about anything I said, please tell me in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts. And it's also helpful for anybody who happens to be watching this video to see the contrasting comments and to get a different perspective about Austen and her work. And also, if you have tips for those who are just embarking on Austen or are struggling to appreciate Austen, leave your thoughts in the comments as well. And I will see you next time. Bye.